On your screen is a University of Illinois at Chicago philosophy professor. His name is Samuel Fleischacker, and he's also president of the International Adam Smith Society. Professor Fleischacker, who was Adam Smith?
Well, Adam Smith, actually that's not such an easy question to answer, but he was a moral philosopher in Scotland in the 18th century who wrote a book on moral philosophy first, and used to give a set of lectures that took you from moral philosophy through law to economics, and eventually wrote a very long book on economics, often considered the founding text in the field, called The Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. And he's been extremely influential ever since, although as a philosopher I wish people would look at him more as a philosopher than just as an economist.
And we will get to that, but Professor Russell Roberts of George Mason University, what has been the impact of The Wealth of Nations?
Well, The Wealth of Nations, besides teaching people a lot of economics along the century since it was published in 1776, really set a whole tone for social science. The combination of empirical work, observation, logic, philosophy, all melted together. It's really an extraordinary work that has had an enormous impact on scholars and the real world, not just scholars, real people.
Professor Fleischacker, when we talk about moral philosophy, what do we mean by that?
Well, what Smith meant by it was something close to what we call social science in part. That is to say, everything that we today call psychology, sociology, economics, political science, all that would be part of moral philosophy as opposed to natural philosophy. Natural philosophy is what Newton did. Moral philosophy covers what we call the social sciences. But it also meant for him, as it does for us, the study of what's right and wrong, good and bad, what human beings are aiming for, what they aspire to, and those things are part of his vision of social science, I would say.
How groundbreaking was his work?
It was enormously influential, as Russell said, almost from the moment it was written. Certainly by, say, the 1790s, it was being read all over. The Prime Minister of England, as of the 1780s, William Pitt, had read it already in college. The founders of the United States, especially Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, were very much influenced by it and were looking to it for guidance as they shaped this country. And then by the time of the French Revolution, it was extremely important in France and Germany. So in a lot of ways, it was the go-to book if you wanted to figure out what governments should do about the economy, but also what governments should do in general.
Professor Russell Roberts, do you use Adam Smith's theories in teaching economics at George Mason?
Well, I do, actually. His insights into the division of labor and specialization in trade, I think, are incredibly timely. We are the only university that I know of at George Mason that has a field in Smithian political economy. I hope to teach classes in that with my colleagues, Don Boudreau and Daniel Klein. So we take Smith quite seriously as a role model for how social science should be conducted.
What about you, Professor Fleischacker? Do you use Adam Smith in your classes?
Well, I do, but I should say that as well as being a moral and political philosopher, I'm a historian of moral and political philosophy, so I'm expected to teach some of the classics of the field, especially of the field in the 18th century. So I do regularly teach a course on Scottish moral philosophy in the 18th century that includes figures like David Hume as well as Adam Smith. And I like to suggest to students that Smith provides a quite remarkable model of how philosophy and social science can be brought together, and sometimes look at his moral philosophy in connection with The Wealth of Nations and see how they interact.
Well, good evening and welcome to this special edition of Book TV on C-SPAN 2 in prime time. We will be live for the next hour looking at Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, and we want to take your calls, emails, and tweets. So if you'd like to call in to our two guests, we'll tell you a little bit more about them in a second, but if you'd like to call in with our two guests and talk about Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations, here's the numbers for you to call. 202 is the area code, 737-0001 if you live in the East and Central time zones, 202-737-0002 for those of you in the Mountain and Pacific time zones, and you can always send us an email at booktv@cspan.org, or you can send us a tweet, twitter.com/booktv is our Twitter address. Now, our two guests are Samuel Fleischacker, and he is in Chicago right now, and he is a professor at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and he is also president of the International Adam Smith Society. Professor Fleischacker, what is that society?
That was a society founded about, that is a society founded about 15 years ago to encourage more scholarly interest in Smith. One of our models was the Hume Society, which did help ratchet up interest, especially among philosophers, in David Hume. Smith is of interest to not just philosophers or economists, to intellectual historians, to literary theorists often these days, and we encourage the study of Smith from all and no political perspective. That's to say, we try to stay away from the political uses of Smith for ideological purposes and simply encourage scholarly work on what he had to say in all these various areas. And we have conferences basically at least once a year, and also try to encourage scholarly work in various other forums.
Now, you've mentioned David Hume twice. Who was he?
David Hume is one of the most important philosophers, most people would say, of the modern period, that is, since about 1600. He was a radical empiricist, that is, someone who tried to develop a theory of knowledge and of morals entirely on the basis of experience. That led him in certain ways to be something of a skeptic, raising doubts about the existence of causality, even of ourselves, and serious doubts about religion. He was also Adam Smith's best friend, and he preceded Adam Smith in writing interesting essays on economics, and many of his insights, in fact, Smith incorporates and then systematizes in the Inquiry into the Wealth of Nations.
And our other guest is Russell Roberts, who is an economics professor at George Mason University here in the Washington, D.C. area, and a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. He has a weekly podcast called Econ Talk. What is that?
It's an hour-long interview with economists, authors, the guy who sold me my car, an expert on ants, anything I think that's interesting that's about the world around us and is related to economics, including a 6-part series I did with Dan Klein on the theory of moral sentiments, Adam Smith's first book. A little bit intense, but for those who are deeply interested, a more scholarly diversion than we usually do in Econ Talk.
Would you consider yourself a fan of Adam Smith's theories?
Big time.
Why?
It's startling how something written so long ago with such charm is still educational and valuable. My thesis advisor at the University of Chicago, Gary Becker, who won a Nobel Prize, when asked who are the economists who most influenced him, he said Adam Smith and Alfred Marshall. I thought, oh, he just kind of exaggerated. But if you go back and read Smith, there's so many insights there. And again, he's such a role model for how to use observation, fact, evidence, and introspection to think about the world around us.
Well, before we go to calls, there's one phrase that Adam Smith is very well known for, the invisible hand. Now, we're going to take that from The Wealth of Nations, and we're going to read the quote to you where he uses the phrase invisible hand with a little bit of text before it and afterwards. So it gets a little long here, but we thought you'd want to see it in perspective. And this is from Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, Book 4, Chapter 2. By preferring the support of domestic to that of foreign industry, he intends only his own security, and by directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain, and he is, in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worse for society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. I have never known much good done by those who affected to trade for the public good. What does that mean?
Well, it means an immense amount of different things to different people. What it means, to my understanding of Smith and to the world around us, is he was drawing on a tradition that was a little preceding to, he's considered the first economist, but Adam Ferguson, who came before him, was also a Scot, talked about things that were the result of human action but not human design. And you take that lineage, Ferguson, Adam Smith, to Hayek, the great 20th century economist, they're all interested in outcomes that are beneficial, sometimes harmful, but usually beneficial that no one intended. We often think of the law of unintended consequences as being negative, and it often is. What Smith and Hayek and Ferguson were talking about was human action that creates an emergent order, not designed from the top down, but from the bottom up by individuals making decisions based on the knowledge that they have access to that no one else does. Understanding that, in my view of economics, is the single deepest thing economists understand that isn't obvious or just common sense. It's profoundly deep, it's nuanced, it's subtle, it gets caricatured a lot as if everything's going to turn out okay. That's not what Smith understood it to mean. And Smith also had a divine aspect to it. The invisible hand has the hint of the divine. He uses the same metaphor in the theory of moral sentiments, and he argues that people, through their internal conscience and their worries about what other people think of them, are led to do things that make the entire society better off. It's a very deep and subtle idea. It's a beautiful idea.
Samuel Fleischacker, same question.
Jump in for a sec? Yeah.
Please.
I agree with most of what Russell said. The exact meaning of the idea of the invisible hand is very contentious among Smith scholars these days. Some say that it refers to the divine. Smith uses it exactly 3 times in all his work, and in one case it does clearly refer to the divine. Here in The Wealth of Nations, many people, and I'd be among them, would say there is no reference to the divine. It's just a metaphor that he's found useful elsewhere. Whether there's any kind of religious background to his economic theory, as I said, is very controversial, but I think Russell's main point is the one to focus on here. Whether there is or not, Smith gives us a purely naturalistic, secular account of how orders can arise without anybody intending them, and for the most part, how individual action can, for the most part, produce something quite good for society as a whole without people intending it. Now, one thing that Smith has in mind, and this is the one thing that I'd want to add to what Russell said, is that he's opposed to the idea that one ought to think that the society would be better in many cases if there were a visible hand. That is, on the one hand, he thinks that governments don't necessarily do a better job, in fact, usually do a worse job in running economies. And on the other hand, he dislikes, as he says in the last sentences you quoted, he dislikes it when merchants claim to be doing something for the good of society. Interestingly, there's a letter Smith wrote about the same time, about a year earlier, in which he refers to Josiah Wedgwood, the famous founder of the pottery firm, claiming that he wanted a certain law which was actually going to benefit his firm for the good of England. And Smith says in the letter, essentially, he'd much rather if Wedgwood admitted that he's doing it for himself. Basically, Smith doesn't trust merchants when they claim that they're doing something for the good of the public. He thinks it's better if they simply act for their private interests. And if everyone does that, on the whole, though again, as Russell said, and this is very important, he doesn't think this is true in every case, on the whole, when people pursue their self-interest in a well-organized society, it will conduce to the public good.
Yeah, I like that point about Smith's worries about people claiming to be serving the public good. It brings to mind the CEO of Goldman Sachs, Lloyd Blankfein, who recently was quoted as saying he does God's work as an investment banker, making sure capital flows to its highest valued use. That's a lovely idea. Unfortunately, in the current system, which is more crony capitalism than real capitalism, he serves Goldman Sachs and masquerades to be serving the public interest. And I think...
I suspect Smith wouldn't even think it's so lovely. I think he'd consider it quite hypocritical. But yes.
Yeah. But Smith understood that a temptation on the part of the merchant or the business person to cloak his self-interest in the public interest, and how dangerous it was.
Samuel Fleischacker, give us a brief bio of Adam Smith. Where was he raised? Where did he go to school, etc.?
Okay, I hope your viewers don't fall asleep in this. He has one of the most boring lives of any important human being. His father died before he was born. He was born in a small town in Scotland called Kirkcaldy. He supposedly was kidnapped by gypsies when he was about 7 years old and then released a few days or weeks later. That's the most interesting thing in his lifetime. After that, he went to university in Glasgow, got a special scholarship to go on to Oxford, came back and taught in Oxford. He was actually a professor, which isn't that common for some of the major intellectuals of the time. Hume was never a professor. Ferguson was largely not a professor. And he took over the course of his own major teacher, Francis Hutcheson. After that, he was hired by a rich nobleman to tutor his kids and supported for the rest of his life on that money, even though he only tutored the kids for a couple of years. And then he retired to sit at home and write The Wealth of Nations. And funnily enough, after writing The Wealth of Nations, in which he argues against duties of any kind, he became a commissioner of customs for about a decade, and then died quietly at home in Scotland, very rich from various sources, although apparently he gave most of his money away quietly without telling anyone, so that he died without much wealth to his name. And that's about it.
Russell Roberts, did he ever visit the United States?
I don't think so, although Sam can verify that.
Yeah. No, he visited very few places. He went to Paris and he met a lot of major intellectuals in France. He met Voltaire, which meant a lot to him. But aside from that one trip to the continent, I don't think he traveled very much outside of the British Isles.
Well, let's get to our viewers' calls. 202-737-0001 if you live in the East and Central time zones. 202-737-0002 for the Pacific and Mountain time zones. And booktv@cspan.org for an email. And booktv is our Twitter address. Rochester, New York. Andrew, you're on with Samuel Fleischacker and Russell Roberts.
Thank you, gentlemen, for coming on tonight. My question is, what about, did Mr. Smith have anything to say about a war tax? I heard that there was a war tax and that General Washington had a war tax. And I was wondering if he talked about what his views were on debt and things like that.
Professor Fleischacker.
Well, there is a long and complicated and very technical last section of The Wealth of Nations devoted to taxes, very much admired by politicians of the time. In fact, some of them at first just picked up the book and ransacked the back to see which taxes might be most useful. And in there, he talks about funding of wars quite explicitly. He talks about what was called the sinking fund, which was a kind of debt system by which Britain financed its wars. He complains about that way of financing wars for technical reasons that I'm going to leave it to Russell to explain if he wishes, and says that he would prefer if wars were funded by a tax paid in every year that they're fought. One reason he says that would be advantageous is that would make the wars shorter. People would be irritated by paying the tax, and that would make them call for the war to come to an end. I'll leave it to Russell to say anything else on this.
Well, my only comment on Smith and taxes, which is so extraordinary for his time, is he deeply understood who really paid the tax as opposed to who the tax was supposed to be paid by. And he also understood the incentives that politicians and taxpayers dealt with. And you know, Sam's example of the pain of war being paid for in a contemporary time is a tremendous example of what Smith was always aware of, which was how incentives worked in affecting both politics and private life.
Gentlemen, we have a tweet here from Joe Orlando. Bookman Joe, he goes by, and he writes, "Who cares? Why should we care about Adam Smith?"
Well, as I said, I teach a class in microeconomics almost every year. I've taught for about 30 years, and I've often assumed, as most economists do, that David Ricardo's insights into trade are the right ones, that diversity is a powerful generator of trade. I've come to understand recently that actually Smith had perhaps the more important idea, which is the role that economies of scale and division of labor have in specialization, even when we're all the same. He has a lot to teach us still. It's not always easy reading. The first 3 or 4 chapters of The Wealth of Nations can be read by anyone today with profit. He has deep understandings that are still relevant. The theory of moral sentiments.
I'd say. First 7 chapters.
Okay, you're even more willing to grab
more
that.
generous than you? Okay.
Yeah, that's okay. But the theory of moral sentiments, his first book, starts off very slowly, very difficult to read. But if you get into it, it's extremely modern. It's all about our self-esteem, our self-worth, the tension between our self-interest and doing the right thing. It's a tremendously powerful book and still very much worth reading. And I finally would add again on trade, Smith's remarks on trade policy, his subtle and ironic understanding of self-interest of merchants, acting often by claiming to be in the public interest, the role of politicians. Still very timely. It's still worth reading.
I would add two quick thoughts to that. One is Smith is cited, of course, very widely by people for political purposes to this day. He's cited as a moral source as well as economic source of the importance of a free trading economy, of what's called libertarianism or classical liberalism. And then he is also cited by people more on the left. There's quite a debate between, let's say, left and right Smithians, and in many ways he has been the origin of ideas that are still very much alive and kicking in the political scene. And if one wants to trace how we've come to these ideas, our own heritage, our own history, how these ideas have come to be kicking around on the political landscape, one really needs to read Smith. The other thing that I'd say is that as a founder of social science, and this goes back to something that Russell said in the beginning of the program, he sets a model for how social science might be done. And he sets a model in which scientific observation is integrated with moral thought in a way that isn't always true among later social scientists. And in that sense, I think he's still very inspiring, worth reading, worth looking to as a model.
Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Bob, please go ahead with your question about Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations.
Yes, hi, good evening, gentlemen. I'd like to know if, well, I'd like either of the professors to comment on any relationship between Adam Smith and Marxism. And where would someone from the 20th century, such as Ayn Rand, where would she fit in regarding their two philosophies? Thanks.
Thank you. Let's start in Chicago with Samuel Fleischacker.
Well, many people who study Marx and are Marxists point out that Marx, for all that he identified Smith in large part with a system that he, Marx, thought should be overthrown or was due to the past, he couldn't get away from admiring Smith. He quotes Smith as a very honest thinker and in fact incorporates some of the more remarkable things Smith says about the suffering and oppression of poor workers as things that he himself could still hold. And in fact, there is a move now, I should say, even though I sympathize with the sort of more left-wing uses of Smith, I'm not a Marxist, I'm not so interested in this myself, but there is a move among many people who were very interested in Marx and have a sort of Marxist orientation towards political economy to recover Smith. All over the academy especially, there are many people interested in Marx who are recovering Smith. I personally don't see any interesting relationship between Smith and Ayn Rand. I think there may be others who do. Her emphasis on self-interest only, I think, is quite alien to Smith. I think he has a very different view of how economies work and how societies work.
Yeah, I want to emphasize that as well. I think poor Adam Smith gets caricatured as the defender of greed.
Right.
He's not a defender of greed. He was someone who understood the power of self-interest, that most of us put ourselves first. That's human nature. He took it as it was. And he urged us in his first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, to overcome that. And he talked about how sometimes we do and sometimes we don't. The other part that's, I think, Randian about Smith that's fascinating is Smith in The Theory of Moral Sentiments talks about the importance of happiness. And he talks about how it appears to him that the world was created for the happiness of humanity. And that's really an extraordinary idea. I think a lot of people learn from Ayn Rand that it's okay to follow your own happiness. But Smith was certainly not a hedonist or a libertine. He was put a huge emphasis on the importance of moral values and conscience and doing the right thing that I think is often absent from Ayn Rand.
So the first edition of The Wealth of Nations was finished in 1776. Did it play any role in the U.S. Revolution?
Well, as Sam pointed out earlier, the founders read Smith. He did revise it, and Sam will know the dates. He revised it, I think, in 1782, quite a bit. The Theory of Moral Sentiments, I think, came out in the 1750s, and I don't know how influential it was.
Jefferson had read The Theory of Moral Sentiments by 1771. The president of Princeton at the time of the revolution and before was a man named John Witherspoon, who was a Scot, and he educated many of the founders. And they read what he, as a Scot, thought was worth reading. Witherspoon is also a signer of the Declaration of Independence and so forth. And he thought Smith's theory of moral sentiments was very worth reading. I wouldn't say, however, that the Wealth of Nations played a role in the revolution. What it did play a role in, very clearly so, is the debates over the Constitution. People were reading it, many of the most important founders were reading it by the mid-1780s. They were looking at Smith's discussion of national banks. They were looking at his discussions of militias and standing armies. Many aspects of the Wealth of Nations were very important to the founders, and in fact, Smith gets cited in debates over the Constitution in 1787 and 1788.
Our next call for our guest comes from John in Dallas, Texas. Please go ahead.
Yes. I studied the Wealth of Nations and the theory of moral sentiments together when I was in college back in the 60s. And my professor insisted that you can't understand one without the other. And I wonder, I read both books again in the last 2 years, and I was amazed at how powerful it is, particularly theory of moral sentiments. He does a powerful job of explaining and reviewing all of philosophy, Plato and Aristotle and later philosophers, and it emphasizes the importance of that in human behavior. And then he goes on, in the Wealth of Nations, he talks a lot about the importance of savings and the accumulation of capital and how money comes to be, and he talks about the colonies, and he talks about the Indies and the colonization. And the point of all this, when you read it, you realize it's still relevant today. And I wonder to what extent our students and our legislators have studied this enough to really understand, because it's relevant, it seems to me, to what is going on today. And my basic question is, how do you think this still relates to the events we're seeing today, particularly with what we've done to our money and what's going on in the financial dealings? I'd like your opinion on it.
Thank you, John. Hey, John, why did you pick it back up and read it? What was your curiosity?
Well, I was an investment banker most of my life, and I've been around investment banking for most of my life, and I saw it being corrupted, and I wanted to pick it up again. And I'm naturally interested in philosophy, and
all right.
I started rereading Aristotle, and amazing when I picked up the theory of moral sentiments again. Adam Smith is so clear in his explanation and comparative. He compares the philosophies and the consequences.
Well, one thing we haven't talked about in the theory of moral sentiments, which I think, again, it's so important to avoid the caricature of Smith. Smith very explicitly says that accumulation of wealth doesn't make you happy, and he warns against it. And he also talks in a very modern way about gadgets and how rich men will fill their pockets with gadgets. Now, they didn't have BlackBerries and iPhones then. They had toothpick holders and other things that he mocks as a source of happiness and prestige, and says they're not real. So the book is full of important moral instruction that I think, as you point out, they have to be read together. And I think what Smith saw was so important is the role of culture, the role of conscience, the role of trust in making a market system work, although his market system was very primitive compared to ours. So the other thing I want to mention, we've talked about how he's a role model for social science. He had a lot of deep insights into the real side of our lives in an economy that are easily forgotten, common fallacies that people subscribe to that Smith understood centuries ago were wrong. His whole attack on mercantilism, his whole attack on the idea that exports create wealth and imports are bad, he understood in 1776 that that was a flawed and fallacious idea. He understood that money, the pieces of paper and the gold and silver, weren't our real wealth. Our real wealth came from what we produce. And he understood in the theory of moral sentiments that what we produce is what gives us happiness, and how we produce it and how we spend our time, not to be spending all our time at the office. I mean, he's a profoundly inspiring thinker in both his insights and his moral instruction.
Professor Fleischacker.
I think it's wonderful that the caller studied both the theory of moral sentiments and the Wealth of Nations together in college. That doesn't often happen today, and I wish it would happen more often. I agree with pretty much everything that Russ just said. I'd just add, Smith says in the theory of moral sentiments that what most makes us happy is conversation with friends. It's sociability. It's having friends and hanging out with them, basically. He doesn't use that phrase, of course, but he does talk a lot about conversation. That is the greatest source of happiness, and that's one of the reasons why morality is essential to happiness, because unless you have a certain level of decency, you won't have any friends. And in that understanding, it's very clear, this is something so interesting, such an interesting irony about this founder of economics, that material goods are really not central to happiness. Anyone who seeks material goods at the costs of friendship and morality is making a huge mistake for Smith. And in this, I think he provides something that I think we can usefully look back to. Here's a man who praises the free market, who is not opposed to the accumulation of material goods. The main reason he wants countries to be wealthy, and he says this quite explicitly, is that he wants poor people to be able to have enough to eat and have clothing on their back and have lodging. The most important goods, he often calls them this, he often says this, are food, clothing, and lodging. In his lectures, they're just abbreviated as FCL by his student notes often. So material goods are important. He doesn't downplay them. He sees the role for them. He sees the role for them especially in helping people rise out of poverty. But they're not the goal. They're not the ultimate goal. And when you read the two books together, you really can see that clearly.
Yeah, Smith says that man wants to be loved and to be lovely, meaning we care deeply about how others perceive us, and we want to earn that respect honestly by being lovely, by doing the things that engender love. And I think what Sam points out, which is extremely important, is often people, even economists, forget what the purpose of economics is. It's not about accumulating material well-being. Wealth is very important, as Smith understood, to help people survive, to live long, extremely important. But it's only a part of the story. And economics, people think, is about the stock market, about interest rates. It is about those things. But as a student told me once, she had learned it from her teacher, economics is the study of how to get the most out of life. It's about our choices. It's about the fact that we don't have an infinite amount of time and an infinite amount of money. We have to use our time, which is so precious, so wisely in the sociability of friends and not merely accumulating material goods. So in that sense, I think economics needs to come back to Smith and not be as focused on the material. And I think it's useful that people understand that that's an important role in economics.
Here's a quote from The Wealth of Nations, Book 3, Chapter 3, Part 3. No large country, it must be observed, ever did or could subsist without some sort of manufactures being carried on in it, and when it is said of any such country that it has no manufactures, it must always be understood of the finer and more improved, or of such as are fit for distant sale.
Well, that's a little bit misleading. I think it might tend to encourage you to think that making stuff is the road to prosperity. Smith certainly didn't say that. What he meant, what he believed was that our skills should be used as widely and successfully and productively as possible. And the way we do that is through our free choices of buying and selling and specialization and in choosing what jobs to do, et cetera. What I think he was referring to in that passage, and maybe Sam knows as well better than I do, I think he's referring to that passage as he was comparing a semi-modern society by our standards, where there's some manufacturing, to a more primitive hunter-gatherer or even agricultural society. He was talking about this natural transition he saw from a hunter-gatherer to a role where artifice, where the making of stuff became a way for people to use the division of labor. And its famous example, the opening of the book, is the pin factory, where an individual, by cooperating with other people and specializing and not trying to make the pins all by oneself, could produce an enormously larger number of pins per person. It's really a deep understanding of productivity and how productivity is enhanced by exchange. Another way to think about
if I could just break in for a second, the quote from the book 3 is actually, I agree it's misleading, and in fact radically so in a way. It's actually part of his polemic against the mercantilist theories that manufacturing is better than agriculture. Smith wants to, one of the main points of The Wealth of Nations as a whole is to say manufacturing isn't better than agriculture and agriculture isn't better than manufacturing. A country should do whatever whatever it's best suited for, or rather the individuals in in a country, if you leave them alone to find their own employment, and this fits with what Russell was just saying, will naturally seek the kind of work that is best remunerated, which means basically the kind of work that's most needed by the society. So the government doesn't need to promote manufacturing at the cost of commerce, manufacturing at the cost of agriculture, or agriculture at the cost of manufacturing. And that may sound like a technical point, but in the context of the day, where there were many people who thought that the job of the government was to promote the kind of industry that makes countries richest. And some people thought that was manufacturing, some people thought it was agriculture. Smith says, no, leave industry alone. Let people find their own work, and that will be the best way to promote wealth.
That idea, which was popular in Smith's time, unfortunately, is still very much alive today, where people think we have to pick and choose the right activities. Ross Perot said it's better to make computer chips than potato chips. That's true if you're good at computer chips. If you're not, you're going to just get even poorer doing something you're not good at.
Adam Smith's importance, when you compare him to people like John Maynard Keynes, F.A. Hayek, Milton Friedman.
Well, they stand on the shoulders of that giant. They're all influenced by Smith. Hayek and Friedman, I think, more than Keynes, but I'm sure Keynes would see himself as in the same tradition.
Go ahead, Professor Fleischacker.
I mean, one difference between Smith and the others is that none of the others that you mentioned saw themselves as a moral philosopher as well as an economist. They sometimes had very interesting things to say about morality and about moral philosophy in certain ways. But Smith's views, I think, integrate the study of human nature from a philosophical point of view with the study of human nature in a more empirical way, more than the others do. Yeah, let me just say a word about that, if I might, which also pertains to this question of how you read The Wealth of Nations and the Theory of Moral Sentiments together. There's one thing that we haven't mentioned that I think we might want to add here, and that is in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, Smith makes clear that in order to understand other human beings properly, to sympathize with them, as he says, we need to imagine ourselves into their situations, and we need to do that in great detail. Otherwise, we won't really appreciate what they're experiencing. And he uses that idea throughout The Wealth of Nations. And in particular, he imagines himself in the position of poor laborers a great deal, which a considerable number of later economists didn't bother to do. That, I think, is that's part of what I mean when I refer to Smith as having this model of how you integrate philosophical thinking about human nature with empirical study. And I don't think that that's so true for some of these later figures, although, of course, they're very important, too, in their own ways.
Yeah, well, the irony, of course, is that Adam Smith coming earlier and living in a poorer time than Milton Friedman or Hayek or Keynes, he was less specialized. And one of the great aspects of economic growth is its role in specialization. And so, of course, those guys were narrower. They weren't as, although they're pretty diverse for economists, all three of them.
Jay in Hurlburt Field, Florida, thank you for holding. You're on with Samuel Fleischacker and Russell Roberts and Adam Smith. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for taking the call. This is a fascinating subject. I am interested in The Wealth of Nations as an exercise in social science, and I've taken a sort of a casual interest in Adam Smith for years, yet I've not read the book. So my question is, who explains Smith better than Smith? Is there, a one-volume clear and accurate analysis or interpretation of what he was communicating? And if so, what is that title?
All right. We'll start with Professor Fleischacker.
Well, I hate to set you on that road because it is really worthwhile reading Smith. Russell said before just the first 3 or 4 chapters of The Wealth of Nations. I said the first 7. You could try reading that and maybe just say the first couple chapters of part 4 of The Wealth of Nations, which include the famous Invisible Hand chapter, and maybe the beginning of book 5. That alone would be very useful. I was introduced to Smith first in high school by Robert Heilbronner's little book on the Great Economist, and I found that a fairly good, clear summary of what Smith has to say. I think it's probably out of date by now, and some people would probably take it to be biased. There's a man named D.D. Raphael, R-A-P-H-A-E-L, who has at least one book, I think 2 books, entitled Adam Smith, which will give you a pretty good summary, very clearly put, and it's very short. So I guess that's what I'd recommend.
And I would mention that at the Library of Economics and Liberty, which is econlib, econlib.org, you can find the entire Wealth of Nations, the entire Theory of Moral Sentiments online, available at no charge, searchable, and it's a lovely and very inexpensive way to get access to the man and his ideas. It's also you'll find an essay there by, I think it's Samuel Fleischacker, on a
Yes.
deep insight of Smith in treating people in a very egalitarian way. Smith, it's a great essay by Sam. He points out that Smith, unlike most of his colleagues of the day, actually thought that poor people knew what was best for them. That he was an anti-paternalist. He recognized that every human being had knowledge that other people didn't have, and as a result were the best judge of what was best for their own interest. And it's a very radical idea, surprisingly, and it changed the world.
Who promotes Adam Smith more these days, Republicans or Democrats, Professor Fleischacker?
Oh, that's changed quite a bit over the past 20 years. I confess my interest in Smith began just about exactly at the moment of the fall of the Berlin Wall. It began shortly before, I should say. But I think that there were a great number of people in the mostly rather left-wing academy who thought, well, okay, Marx is dead, what should we read now? And quite a few found Smith. In fact, this has also happened in the political world. Gordon Brown, the Prime Minister of Britain, even when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, has been a very proud and enthusiastic reader of Smith. I've been told that Barack Obama is also a reader of Smith. Coming out of the University of Chicago, I wouldn't be surprised. So I think at this point, you'll find people on both sides of the aisle quite enthusiastically quoting Smith, though sometimes for different purposes, which actually takes us back right to the Smith's own time, when people on both sides of many issues, including some of the same issues we talk about today, cited Smith.
Well, I think I agree with what Sam said, but I think Republicans have laid claim to Smith, unfortunately, because they use rhetoric that they think is Smithian about markets and competition. They often don't live up to it, which I think is a great tragedy. I'd like to see politicians actually internalize those lessons rather than just use rhetoric for covering up self-interest.
Bill in Fort Lauderdale, good evening.
Good evening. Thank you for taking my question. I was interested in finding out from the professors essentially how John Maynard Keynes might have been influenced in specific areas. I know that today consumerism is the result of Dr. Keynes, I believe, and I was wondering if they had any comment on that.
Professor Roberts.
Well, Keynesians and Keynes himself were worried about people saving too much and not spending. I do think that's a mistake, although a lot of people would disagree with me. A lot of people think that consumerism, as you described it, is the foundation of an economy. That certainly is not a Smithian idea. I think the part that is Smithian is perhaps Keynes' interest in animal spirits. And what Keynes meant by animal spirits, he meant a few things, but one of the things he meant was the emotional and psychological aspect of entrepreneurs, their confidence or their worries and fears. And Smith had a lot to say about that. Smith was very interested in how people are often overconfident about their prospects for success, or cautious or fearful about the future, and perhaps Keynes was influenced there, but other than that, I'd say not so much.
From Book 4, Chapter 8, consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production, and the interest of the producer ought to be attended to only so far as it may be necessary for promoting that of the consumer.
Well,
So now that...
Go ahead, Sam.
Sorry, that's just one of the tidbits that it's one of my pet peeves, that it gets quoted a lot out of context, as if Smith wanted to say all we should do is consume, as opposed to say help other people, which Smith certainly didn't believe. In context, that's again part of Smith's polemic against merchants who want the government to help them. In particular, who want to help them promote certain colonial policies by which, for instance, the colonies can only buy from British manufacturers. To that, Smith is saying, listen, the consumers are what count, not you manufacturers. The government shouldn't be out to help you produce more. The point of production is how it gets to the consumer. And in that context, he says, government should be looking to what the consumer needs and not to what the producer claims that he or she needs.
Daniel, Manhattan.
Sorry, Russ.
Daniel, Manhattan,
Yes.
you're on the air.
Yes, our current political discourse and economic, discourse, Adam Smith is always seized upon by anti-government voices, and but weren't the governments that were around at the time of Adam Smith, weren't they more? They were monarchies, and weren't they like monopoly monarchies that were really more akin to? I don't want to offend anybody, but like sort of mafia-run organizations.
You're onto something there. Adam Smith did live at a time of a lot of tyranny, a lot of despotism, and a lot of plunder by monarchs and others. And as a result, he was very concerned about the power of the state. And certainly in the democracy that he was living in at the time, parliamentary democracy, he was worried about it there as well. But you're right. I think it's important to remember that that context of the time he lived, that was part of the reason he was anti-government. More importantly, though, I think the reason he was anti-government, to the extent he certainly wasn't an anarchist, by the way. He certainly saw a role for government in defense, in the court system, and sometimes in other areas. But his worry was a worry that we should all have at all times, which is the concentration of power and the incentives of politicians to do the right thing. That's always a genuine concern.
Samuel Fleischacker, what did Adam Smith think about the East India Company?
Oh, he hated the East India Company. He thought that was a huge mistake. One of the worst things he thought that could happen is to have merchants rule, or rulers become merchants, basically, because merchants have an interest that is quite different from the interests of citizens. So he actually wanted it disbanded, and that's one of his major recommendations in The Wealth of Nations. And it's actually quite a shame, something of a betrayal of his legacy, that even his friends kept the East India Company going after he died. Let me just say, in connection with what Russell just said, I agree with all of that. I, in fact, would even add that in the context of the time, Smith is also worried about the king corrupting the democracy because he was capable of buying out the voters in many places. But I would say that here, libertarians who use Smith to cry against big government do have a point. I think whether you're on the left or the right, one thing to learn from Smith is that government can't solve all our problems, and some of the reasons for that don't have to do with the faults of monarchy. One thing Smith says often, and one thing that I confess I, having come from a more left-wing background, learned from Smith, is that governments just don't know the right kinds of things to run large economies, to run many things in small local situations. You just can't trust a group of legislators in a centralized office in the middle of the country to know what's going on all throughout the country better than the people there know themselves. As Smith says, ordinary people can judge better in their own local situations than any legislator can do for them. And I think that is a very important kind of message. It doesn't throw out a role for government. Government can still do many important things. But one has to ask oneself always, should government do this? Could this be better done by the private sector? I think that's something Smith does always want you to ask.
Len, Newton, Massachusetts. Good evening.
Good evening. I've just finished reading The Wealth of Nations in a one-volume paperback, so here's a slightly technical question for either of the gentlemen. It's 1,215 pages in that volume. Would The Wealth of Nations suffer at all if the entire disquisition on silver were removed? Thank you.
Well, there are a lot of passages in Smith that are hard for moderns to read. That's when I said, you should read the first 3 or 4 chapters. I meant at a minimum, but I didn't mean to suggest that was the only part that was readable. But a lot of Smith is difficult to read because he's dealing with economic issues or institutional details that aren't relevant to us today or we're not familiar with. So right. It can be very difficult going. To me, what's striking is that for a book written in 1776, how much of it is still worth reading. But I think the wise reader who's not a scholar of Smith, as Sam is, and that would include me, would, when going back to the book, would dip in where it's most judicious and profitable.
I think that a good excerpted edition could be put out. I haven't yet seen one that I liked because I think they often leave out some of the important things about workers and about public schooling and about religion in Book 5 The digression on silver, I agree with the caller, is the first thing I think most people would want to cut out. On the other hand, I gather, Russ can correct me on this, that it's one of the things that modern economists think is most brilliantly done, and it actually makes a very important and impressive point. This guy was tracing prices of silver over 400 years, quite a remarkable feat. Even with modern scholarship, let alone with what he had available to him at the time, in order to prove that the price of silver does not inevitably decline, as his mercantilist opposition said. And I think he does a pretty good job of it, though I can't really judge the technical details.
Well, I just would add, I think it's important for any reader of any economist, not just Adam Smith, to be skeptical of the conclusions that are drawn. A lot of times, they're not always right. Smith wasn't right about everything. He wasn't always, it doesn't come from Mount Sinai, The Wealth of Nations. It's not scripture. It's a profoundly provocative and intellectually impressive work. You should take many things in there with a grain of salt and learn from it.
The edition we have here on the table is the 5th edition, which was published in 1789. He made revisions throughout the 5 editions. But this is in the public domain right now, correct? Anybody could publish this book.
That's why I said at the Library of Economics and Liberty, econlib.org, they have an extraordinarily high-quality scholarly version. It's not the, some knockoff or other edition. But yeah, it's available.
Anybody could take it and edit it in any way they choose to. Is that correct also?
I think that's true on the last part, yeah.
Silver Spring, Maryland. Albert, hi.
Hi. Thank you for my call. I just wanted to ask a question. Adam Smith, I read it, but he lived in a very simple time of simple economy. Now we are in a complex financial situation, derivatives and so on, globalized economy. How is he relevant to the problems we have today?
Well, it's a common critique of certain older thinkers that, their work doesn't apply anymore, it's outdated. Smith didn't anticipate derivatives, for example, or credit default swaps, or worldwide investment banking. And that's true, he didn't. Although he had many things in his day that had some of the flavor of it. But that's why you don't want to read Smith for explicit understanding of things. But what he did understand, many, many things he understood, are timeless. He understood the role of human nature. He understood our flaws. He understood our highest aspirations and natures. He understood the role of incentives. He understood the role of opportunity cost. He understood that money isn't everything. He understood that pieces of paper aren't wealth, and that what we can really acquire is the true measure of our standard of living with our scarce labor. He's really got a lot to say.
To take, let's say, 3 specific things, which I suspect, perhaps unusually, Russ and I may agree on, even on specifics. He has a criticism of the balance of trade, the doctrine of the balance of trade, in which it seems to me he was dead on then and is dead on now. He understands the importance of education and the importance of education for everyone. And he understands the wastefulness of war, and he says things about the wastefulness of war that could have come right out of the last decade's debates.
And Samuel Fleischacker, this tweet came in. I would like you to respond. In your view, what would Smith think of the Great Society, affirmative action, and welfare? It's from Blue Capitalist.
Well, that would take a very long time to answer.
You have 13 seconds.
I've written 2 books on it. So the short answer is those are all issues that were not remotely on the table at the moment he died. Some of them were on the table within 10 years after he died. There was a huge debate about poor law, what the government should do to aid the poor, which he didn't get to participate in because he died a little too early. My own view is that among the things Smith thought government could do and should do if it could do it well, was help the poor reach a condition in which they could participate on the same level as everybody else in the market. And my view would be that he would support something like universal health care today, for instance, though there are many Smithians who would disagree with me.
You're crazy,
Sam. There are many aspects of Smith that would go out in the other direction. He can be read in both ways, and he can be read in both ways, I think, because he wasn't really addressing those issues.
Healthcare. Why do you think?
I have no idea what Smith's position on healthcare policy minutiae is. I just think he'd be highly skeptical of a top-down, single-payer type solution. But That's a long debate for another time, Sam. I'm shocked by how much we agree on so far.
And both of our guests are also authors as well as professors. Samuel Fleischacker, one of his books is On Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and Russ Roberts' most recent book is called The Price of Everything. You can see it there on your screen. Who published it?
Princeton University Press, and it is about emergent order, the idea of the invisible hand that Hayek particularly focused on the role of prices in steering resources. It's a novel, by the way. It's written for a general audience, and it's very Smithian in its flavor.
Monroe, Louisiana. Paul, thanks for holding your own.
Good evening, gentlemen. In my short collegiate career studying economics at Auburn University, the name of Adam Smith was very rarely spoken without Thomas Malthus coming up. And the contrast between Smith's optimism and Malthusian pessimism, and the different schools of positivism and normative economics. And we see this today where we see central planning being looked to for global warming, and maybe we're better off with individuals deciding what could happen better with Adam Smith's approach to people looking after their own interest and taking care of things that way.
Professor Roberts.
Well, I'm not going to pretend that Adam Smith would be interested in a private solution of global warming. I think he'd be worried, as I am, about centralization of power in the hands of bureaucrats, and I think that's something to be concerned about in any solution of any social problem. But I think the more general point is that Smith wasn't so aware or didn't have to deal with what modern economists call externalities, and that's a case of pollution. Global warming would be an example of that, and private solutions to those, although they often make progress, they may struggle, and there may be a role for government in there, and that Smith perhaps would have recognized, maybe not. I think he'd have been worried, as I am, of the role of centralization of power in steering people's lives, not because so much that centralized power doesn't fully understand what's on the ground, which was Sam's earlier point, but also that power corrupts, and I think Smith understood that very, very clearly.
Samuel Fleischacker, Craig Bardo tweets in, did Smith have much to say about monetary policy?
Oh, well, that's the one I would throw back at Russell, actually. I think he does have some things to say, but some of this is much more technical and really better handled by professional economists. If I could just say something about the centralization of power, going back to the prior question for a second. I think one reason why Russell and I can agree in principle and disagree in specifics about some of these issues is that Smith basically has two broad views about political economy, or politics and economy. On the one hand, the government should do everything that is important to be done in a society and individuals can't do for themselves. That's very broad and very vague, but he does say that that should happen. And he mentions public schooling, especially for the poor, as one thing that might fall into that category. On the other hand, he is definitely worried, as Russell is, and I am, and as Russell says, about the centralization of power. And so the question is, how do you balance those things? How do you have government take care of problems that individuals can't handle on their own, if that's the case, and global warming might be such a case, healthcare might be such a case, without, on the other hand, contributing to the dangers of great centralization. One difference between Smith and Malthus on these issues is a difference that has to do with historical events. Between the time Smith wrote and the time Malthus wrote, there was a great famine, and things looked darker than they had done in Smith's lifetime, and there was also the French Revolution, and the dangers of government and governmental reform looked greater than they had to Smith. So that's one reason for a contrast between them.
And we're going to get Professor Roberts very quickly to address Craig Bardo's tweet. Did Smith have much to say about monetary policy?
Well, he had a lot to say about monetary policy. But the part I want to mention that I think is particularly interesting for our current situation is Scotland between, I think it was 1720 and 1870, 1750 and 1870. For over a century, Scotland had banks issuing their own money. They had private currency in circulation. My colleague at George Mason, Larry White, is an authority on that phenomenon. And Smith traces out the incentives that banks had to be careful with their currency that they issued because they didn't want to lose the trust of their customers. And that's an extraordinarily important lesson, I think, for us today as we look at the role of the Federal Reserve. And I think it's a reader would profit from reading about private banking in Scotland, something Smith had a lot of interesting things to say about.
And in Cedar Springs, Michigan is Luke. Luke, please go ahead.
Yeah, my question has to do with David Hume and how much influence do you think that the relationship between Adam Smith and David Hume and David Hume's philosophy had on Adam Smith?
Professor Fleischacker.
That's, again, a great question and an enormous subject, much debated. In many ways, you can find almost an anticipation of almost every particular idea of Smith somewhere in Hume. I think Smith also tends to disagree with Hume in small ways, at least, on almost every subject. So they have a slightly different view about sympathy. They have a slightly different view about the role of self-interest in people's lives. They agree largely about the nature of government, the dangers of large government, but also the ways in which government can help society and the need for government in administering justice. They agree on a lot of economic issues and disagree on some small ones. It's very hard to tease them apart. One important difference for the purposes of this discussion is that Smith put all his thoughts about economics and government into one large systematic discussion, and that's not something that Hume did.
Ed, Baltimore, good evening.
Yes, I have a question concerning spending and savings. What would he have to say about the government spending today? I mean, what would happen? Maybe either the economists could address this. How much of total GDP is all government spending? And if we cut out most of that spending, just except for the necessaries of, let's say, the war, any war or defense, we'll call it defense, then what would employment be like? And without large amounts of government spending on the national, on the state, and the local level, I mean, how would capital keep enough employment going? Because in the present moment, business isn't spending. Individuals are just barely spending. And if the government doesn't spend, where does the spending come from?
Well, I think Smith would reject, as many economists do, but not all, the idea that somehow we have to keep spending up to keep the economy afloat. That's a common view. It's a Keynesian view, and it is a mainstream view among economics, but there's a lot of people who think that's the wrong approach to take. But Smith was not a macroeconomist in that sense. I think the part that Smith would have a lot to say about today would be the example, for example, of bailing out General Motors or AIG, or all the money that's flowed into the investment banks who made lousy decisions. I think he'd recognize that that's money ill spent. That's money that's not for the good of the society at large. It's money that's good for the people who get it. And he would, I think, be very skeptical about its value. And I think that's the most important lesson. Although the size of government is a concern in terms of the power of the state, the question is, what do they spend it on? As Sam pointed out earlier, Smith was an advocate for the government doing things that people couldn't do for themselves. Well, people aren't going to buy lousy cars for themselves. You got to get the government to do that for them. And I think that's an enormous mistake.
And we've got about 5 minutes left with our two guests, Samuel Fleischacker in Chicago. He's a philosophy professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and Russell Roberts, an economics professor at George Mason University. Discussion about Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. Kansas City, Missouri, Mel.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. Love watching Book TV. I watch it all weekend. I've tried to read Adam Smith a few times. I was unable to, well, I don't want to say comprehend, but I'm a chem major in college, but it appears that some of the underlying doctrines in this book is that the consumer, it's almost a consumer-driven market, which it should be. The merchant should tailor their products to so the consumer can buy them, which would actually help the economy. As far as the government or bailing out the banks and that, and it not being consumer driven, I'm curious on how the underlying doctrines in Adam Smith's book would actually see the results of that.
Well, you know, Smith talks about the natural tendency of producers, people in business, to gather together to try to exploit consumers, and he saw competition as a great way of preventing that. And he also saw the world of commerce as a way of enhancing our virtues. That by, as you said earlier, by making sure that you provided a product that people liked, you had to put yourself in the shoes of the consumer. You had to figure out what the consumer wanted. And that force is extremely important in Smith, and I'd say very missing from some of our public policy of the last 2 or 3 years. I think we've made some disastrous mistakes, and in particular, the consequences of those mistakes, whether you thought they were good or bad, whether there wasn't a better choice, some people would argue. I disagree, but if you thought there wasn't a better choice, we certainly now are going to have to deal with the incentives that has for the future, and that's something Smith would have said I had a lot to say about.
And Andrew sends in a tweet, and I want to start with you, Professor Fleischacker, for both of you to answer very quickly, if you could. What would Smith say about the American economic system if he were alive now? Has government intervention replaced the invisible hand?
Well, again, we live in very different circumstances, and this is an issue that it's a very difficult question to answer, and I think resisting answering that question is very important. Jumping in and saying one knows what Smith would say today is, I think, quite dangerous. I do have a section at the end of my book, if I may tout my book, called Learning from Smith Today, in which I suggest that there are ways to use him for both right and left-wing approaches to contemporary policy. I don't think that government in the United States is in fact activist enough in some areas, as I indicated before, that would include healthcare for me. On the other hand, again, Russell, I'm surprised at how much we agree. I entirely would agree that we shouldn't have bailed out the banks. And I would agree that that's something Smith would have said. It's very important that businesses fail when they make bad decisions. That is something Smith says, and that is a kind of government intervention that he opposes. Coming in to prop up industries because you think that particular industry is necessary for the economy. I think Smith would have been worried by our very large defense establishment. As I said before, he worries about government expenditure on war, that there can be much too much of that. I don't think he would have been as worried about spending on welfare policy. I do think it's quite clear that he would have opposed government intervention to prop up various specific industries.
All right. Before you answer, Professor Roberts, we want to get Loretta in here, and we're almost out of time. Go ahead, Loretta, in Lansing, Michigan.
Yes. Businesses are to make profit. Consumers are to afford. And I do not believe that it's as complicating as it sounds. I think it's a matter of physics. It's the way we are looking at the situation of the consumer and the business.
And Professor Roberts, you get the last word.
Well, there's a certain natural health in capitalist society when it's properly organized, which is businesses that want to thrive in a profit and loss system have to make customers happy. But as Smith would remind us, and as Milton Friedman often reminded us, it's a profit and loss system. So businesses that don't do well at serving the consumer or who make bad investments have to take losses. If we don't let businesses take losses, we don't get real capitalism, we get crony capitalism, and that is the road to a very unhealthy world.
And that will have to be the last word. We are out of time. Russell Roberts of George Mason University, one of his many websites is Econ Talk, if you'd like to go there and communicate directly with him. Samuel Fleischacker, who is also the president of the International Adam Smith Society out in Chicago, adamsmithsociety.net. Gentlemen, thank you both very much for being on Book TV in prime time.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Want to let you know that we've got 2 more hours of programming coming up tonight, and every night this week we are going to have a live hour from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time. We've picked a couple of books that have influenced the American political system. Tonight we looked at The Wealth of Nations with Adam Smith. On Friday night we're looking at Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, written in the early 60s. And we'll have her biographer and another gentleman on to talk about Silent Spring, and that'll be on Friday night. Now, tomorrow night, we're having 2 current economic authors on to talk about the current economic situation. Amity Schlaze and Dean Baker will be here. from 8 to 9 p.m. to take your calls, emails, and tweets. And then on Thursday night, we're going to be talking about the Afghanistan war with two Afghanistan authors, Seth Jones and Mark Moyer. Will be here to take your calls and tweets. But 2 more hours of Book TV in prime time this congressional recess week. Coming up next is Henry Paulson in conversation with Warren Buffett just this past week on his new book, On the Brink. And then after that is an afterwards that we taped with Peniel Joseph being interviewed by Washington Post national editor Kevin Merida, Dark Days, Bright Nights. But now here's Henry Paulson and Warren Buffett.
Well, Hank,